Just as we cannot understand texts only as physical objects, the mythical stories that Greek and Latin literary texts precisely give us cannot be described as static entities either, but as dynamic representations of human experience itself. Actually, the same myth narrated by different authors may have a completely different approach or a flagrant intertextual tension with previous authors. Thus, a text is reused, modified, or reinterpreted according to the author's own interest. This is the case of the mythical episode of the Phrygian Niobe. Remember that the traditional version of the myth tells that Niobe challenged the goddess Leto because Niobe claimed that her ability to bear children was much greater than Leto's, since the goddess had only conceived 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. For that reason, Leto sends her 2 children to murder the entire offspring of Niobe. Then, as you know, Niobe ends up petrified on Mount Sypilus, as we can see in the image. Homer is the first poet who offers the very first reference to Niobe's myth in Greek literature, and resorts to this mythological character in the last book of his Iliad, when, after Prince Hector's death, the Trojan king Priam goes to the tent of Achilles in order to beg him to release the outraged corpse of his son Hector. At first, Achilles offers him food and drink, but the old man refuses both of them because of his pain. It is at this moment when Achilles recommended Priam that he should eat, since even Niobe herself, despite her suffering due to the slaughter of all her children, also remembered food. Homer makes use of the mythological episode of Niobe as an exemplum in a comparative form, but with an exemplifying or paradigmatic function. However, in Aeschylus' fragmentary Niobe, the poet departs completely from the comparative form of the Homeric mention of Niobe. Here, Aeschylus only intends to convey a particular teaching, namely, human beings cannot be pretentious and must respect the superiority of the gods. Thus, Niobe's myth has here an evident paradigmatic function. Both Homer and Aeschylus are clear examples of how texts themselves and their interpretation are not inflexible, but they do change depending on the literary needs of each author. The same happens in the Hellenistic period. Callimachus, for instance, in his hymn to Apollo, reuses the mythological character of Niobe within a very different literary context, but with the same mythical function as we have previously seen in Aeschylus. The speaker of the hymn, whether Callimachus or not, intends to give some instructions to the faithful, especially how they should keep silent when Apollo is praised. To exemplify this particular instruction, Callimachus makes allusive references to some myths, such as Achilles' death, the lament of Thetis, or the faithful story of Niobe. The paradigmatic function of Niobe's story appears once again because Callimachus tries to show that if characters such as Thetis or Niobe herself shelve their sorrows in Apollo's presence, the same should be done by those who attend to Apollo's ritual. It should be also noted the Callimachian veiled influence of the use and function of Niobe's myth now in Latin literature. Claudius Claudianus, the poet of the court of the Western Roman Emperor Honorius, dedicates a panegyric on the third consulship of Honorius. Claudianus makes use of another metamorphic myth, this time the episode of the Iliades, Phaeton's sisters, to show that even the 3 sisters, who never cease in their laments due to the death of Phaeton, they actually remain silent and endure their tears in the emperor's presence. It is a quite similar use to that made by Callimachus himself in the hymn to Apollo. It seems that Claudianus may have been inspired in some way by the Callimachian text on Niobe, although he clearly innovates as he changes the characters' names, Niobe versus Iliades and Apollo versus Honorius. Likewise, in the epigrammatic genre, the paradigmatic function of the story of the Phrygian Niobe is used by several epigrammatists, such as Theodoria's composition. We can read the paradigmatic function of myth at the end of the composition, but also in Meleager's epigram. Again, the exemplifying of the paradigmatic function of Niobe's story appears once again in the last 2 verses, as we can read in the presentation. And the mother who erst took pleasure in her stone's chatter, now for horror stands like a rock built of flesh. The same happens in the following composition of Antipater of Thessalonica, and again, the paradigmatic function appears in the last distich. But if we now turn to the Greek bucolic poetry, we will see that in the poem called Megara, falsely attributed to the poet Moschus, as you all know, the traditional details of Niobe's characterization are suitably included, but with certain innovations. The text is about how Alcmena, Hercules' mother, says that a mother cannot be reproached or blamed for crying the lack of her children. Thus, to exemplify this idea, the pain of a mother, the poet decides to reuse the proverbial reference to the unfortunate Niobe, who will never cease in her laments because of the loss of all her offspring. So, if Niobe does not stop lamenting his unhappy fate, Alcmena won't be less. The novelty here consists in how the poet linked these two mythological characters, Niobe and Alcmena, as exemplar of suffering mothers, in addition to the comparative function of the myth itself, which clearly differs from the dogmatic and lapidary nature of the epigrammatic genre. The fusion of these two thematic episodes, that is to say, the Herculean cycle and the myth of Niobe in the Megara, will be also reused, this time by a Latin author, Seneca. Through the comparative function of Niobe's myth, Seneca manages to equate Alcmena and Niobe again in Hercules Oetaeus. However, it is curious how the same author uses the same mythical episode about Niobe in two of his tragedies, but with two completely different literary functions, as we will see later on. Unlike in Hercules Oetaeus, in Seneca's Agamemnon, when the chorus is about to list the gods to be praised, such as Apollo, Juno, Lucina, or Pallas, Seneca also mentions Artemis and her revenge, namely the slaughter of Niobe's children. Seneca ends the mythical narratio with a general advice to all mortals, as we can read in the last parts of the fragment selected here. Colit impensi femina vircenum ingeminum, both men and women lavish worship on your twin godhead. Thus, within the religiosity distinctive of the tragedy, Niobe becomes an exemplum dissuasorium of what happens if anyone challenges the gods, hence the paradigmatic function that the episode clearly displays here. Not only do we find references to Niobe's myth in Latin poetry, but also in prose. It is the case of Cicero, who uses again the character of Niobe with a comparative function in Diputationes Tusculanae. Cicero affirms here that traditionally good people are those who show unbearable pain and sadness when they lose a family member or a beloved friend. To exemplify this particular reflection, Cicero names in a numeratio exemplorum some mythological episodes appropriate to his reflection, of course, such as Bellerophon's, Ecubas, or Niobe's myths. The comparative function of Niobe's story is once again present, but there are also new mythical details, like Niobe's representation as the externalization of exaggerated pain, far away from her traditional facet as a suffering mother, and far away from the crime and punishment pattern in which the episode is traditionally framed as well. Moving now to Ovid, the poet resorts repeatedly to the myth of Niobe in some of his works. In AMORES, for instance, the reference to Niobe is only one more erudite mythical example. On the other hand, in TRISTIA, Ovid retakes the comparative function of Niobe's myth and makes a comparison between Niobe and himself. Just as tears serve Niobe as a relief, Ovid chooses to write, to complain, and try to obtain the emperor's forgiveness. The same happens in EPISTULAE ex PONTO, because Ovid compares here Niobe's sorrows with his own sorrow in exile. The innovation here resides in the combination within a lamentation context of Niobe's figure and a historical event, the fights between the people that live in the Pontus Euxinus, where Ovid was in exile. This combination of the myth and the historical event is clearly observed through the coinciding elements, such as the arrows, the cold, or the terrible fate, as we can read in the first part of the fragment selected here. But in addition, the following Ovidian innovation comes from the mythical variant that the poet includes here. a non-suffering Niobe after her metamorphosis. Thus, the traditional version of Niobe's petrification changes completely due to the poet's intention. Ovid wants to be like Niobe here, who, after being transformed, lost consciousness of pain. As we can read, I am one who in vain wished to be a stone. Similar ideas also appear in other authors, such as Ausonius, Sidonius Apollinaris, or the Greek poets Julianus and Macedonius. On the very contrary, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the poet is interested in collecting all the typical elements that form part of the traditional myth, in adding some details of his own invention, and in shaping the amplificatio of Niobe's entire myth. Ovid reuses numerous preceding elements, both lexical and thematic elements. Regarding the lexicon, the influence of the Callimachian text on Niobe seems to be evident. For instance, Enifrigie esterictae in Callimachus and fixa capumine montis in Ovid, Petros in Callimachus saxum est in Ovid, Dacriois in Callimachus and fled in Ovid, Marmaron in Callimachus and Marmora in Ovid. Regarding the Ovidian innovations, I would like to highlight the combination of the mythical episodes of Arachne and Niobe too. And regarding the mythical content, Ovid seems to make a kind of collage of all the preceding elements of Niobe's episode. As an example, I would like to highlight the hair of Niobe, already in Theodoridas, the description of the death of Niobe's daughters, in particular the panic that one of them feels when facing her imminent death, already in Theodoridas, but also in Meleager, or even the happiness of Niobe. Remember that Ovid affirms that had Niobe not boasted precisely of her immense happiness, she would have been the happiest mother for sure. It is this idea of Niobe's possible happiness what brings to our minds the following composition by Antipater of Thessalonica. Antipater manages in this composition, to compare Hermocratia's happy life with the unhappy existence of Niobe without children. But now, the funereal and moralizing context of Niobe's story in Ovid's Metamorphoses and in the Greek epigrammatists changes completely in Propertius' elegies. Elegy 220, for example, deals with Propertius' commitment of fidelity to Cynthia. The poet compares here two situations, the cry of Niobe and the querellae amoris of Cynthia. Therefore, Propertius substitutes the funereal and moralizing context of the story for a loving context with a clear comparative function. Besides, another ingenious reinterpretation of the myth is offered in Elegy 3:10. This elegy is about the birthday of Propertius' beloved Cynthia. So the poet claims that this day should be perfect, without wind, waves, clouds, and of course, without Niobe's crying. Thus, the poet includes the motif of the unfortunate Niobe within a festive, convivial, or celebratory context, a completely innovative literary context in comparison to previous texts and previous authors. The dynamism of text can now be seen in Marshall's epigrams, who surprisingly includes Niobe's myth into an erotic context. This composition is about a dialogue with Matrinia, an elderly woman to whom Marshall explains that he can actually love an older woman, but not her, Matrinia, since she is closer to being a corpse. Thus, Marshall completes the composition with inclusion of the mythical figures of Hecuba and Niobe as mature women who can still be loved, as long as Hecuba has not become a dog, and as long as Niobe has not been petrified yet. This new erotic context with satirical hints in which Niobe's myth is inserted will have some literary impact, since the Greek poet Macedonius will reuse this love or erotic context in one of his epigrams, as we can see in the presentation. Here, the lyrical subject compares Niobe, who despite being a stone is capable of mourning, with the dura puella, called Evipe, because Evipe, even though she is human, she is so insensitive to the Erastes love that she seems a real stone. To conclude, we have been able to verify how Greco-Latin authors have reused, expanded, modified, or reinterpreted the multiple preceding texts that narrate Niobe's myth by shaping the story to a greater or lesser extent in order to make it appropriate to their works. They have included or removed certain mythical elements. They have reused the Callimachian lexicon. They have created new different literary contexts, and they have changed the use and function of the mythological episode itself. So to sum up, all these authors managed to offer infinite new aspects and infinite new literary contexts in which they are able to reuse or include the everlasting story of the stony Niobe. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.